Okay, well, it looks like we're slightly late, but I'll give it a whack. I'm RJ Downard. Here I am on the Evolution Hour, the exciting world of tippity types and clickety clacks and opening logos and troubles in paradise, the methodology of creationism at tortucan.wordpress.com. And here we are to start yet another show. Okay, let's stop that little puppy and close that down and bring our bloody menus back in line. I was just trying to deal with a minor detail that came up from Brian in the live chat. He was asking about his line spacing issue in Evolution Slam Dunk, and I wasn't entirely sure of what that was referring to. It may be, I don't see any lines that are oddly spaced in there, and the margins all seem about the same. So at the moment, I can't answer that one, and we'll have to address that at some later point. I'm all new to this publishing thing, and every once in a while I'll spot some obscure little typo that pops up both in Phileas Fogg and in Evolution Slam Dunk, and I'm trying to do still better and more precisely in the new book with Jackson Wheat. And Jackson hopefully will be bumping into the room in about a half an hour or so. He was busy with other stuff. But the main task, oh, hi, we got Immutable Destiny and Old Scratch, hello. The main subject matter of the series for a while has been working off of, I don't know whether you want to call it a dare or a challenge, to do a full source analysis of Contested Bones, which is this creationist book by Rupi and Sanford, came out in 2017. It lacks a bibliography. It lacks an index, which makes it tough to find out what the hell's in it. So I've constructed a bibliography and guide to be able to work my way through it and tracking down all their sources, of which it gets in a way a little easier because they're repeating themselves a lot in this particular section, where they're trying to argue that human beings, us, our species, and Australopithecines coexisted. No. And what it involves is misrepresenting what Homo sapiens versus Homo the genus refers to, because we do indeed find overlap with the very early member, Homo habilis and that bunch, that are coming onto the scene at the same time that you still find some Australopithecines knocking around, but they aren't our species. And Rupi is doing just a whiz-bang job. Brian says, in my copy, there are 5 spaces between the words respectively that you could see, then go back to, let me take a look at that. It could be the kerning thing that's going on. Respectively, evolutionary, let's see. 5 spaces respectively that you could see then, and then goes back to regular. Okay, it could possibly refer to the wackiness of the kerning thing. I'll have to put a little post-it note in on that. And that's so I want to find the word respectively. I will check back to that later. We're geeking out on typographical issues. So sorry. Anyway, the first issue that Contested Bones was jumping into in this section related to the orangutan bone or baboon bone that was found to be one of the ones in the Lucy skeleton. And there was a technical paper written on this in 2015, which went out of their way to say that this was an understandable goof because the bones look so much similar in all primates, and that that they weren't challenging in any way any of the analysis of Lucy. They put that right up front in their abstract. Needless to say, Rupi never cited that part. They were instead trying to cast doubt upon the whole paleoanthropology discipline by the fact that once in a while bones, remember, Lucy wasn't found as a fully articulated skeleton. As many of these things are, they're found as the remains that have been washed together and disintegrated. The fully articulated skeletons are relatively rare in the fossil record to begin with. And so they're playing cherry-picking games to try to undermine all of this field. So fortunately, that particular paper is available open access, so I put a link to that. You may be aware of the fact that that's one of the big deal things that I do in what I consider appropriate video analysis, even though I'm very rudimentary. I don't have fancy graphics and all that kind of stuff. But I strongly urge, and I hope everybody listening to me, when they encounter a video that's on a science subject that neglects to give references as direct links in their course video description, that you tell them to change that. You don't have to have a pile up of references. That's not necessary. But the salient points that you're going to bring up, if they're available open access for anybody to follow up, put those in there so you don't have to play hunt and peck to try to find out the references on your own manually. And especially if you may not immediately be able to spot the location where it is open access, you're helping them along, and you're speeding up the process. I want everything in this area that can speed up the ability of our side to marshal information and to present it, to do that, because we have no excuse not to do that in 2019. If I can do it, anybody can. So that's a standard procedure. Anyway, immutable destiny. So you're absolutely right. The beauty of science, much to creationist dismay, is science is self-correcting. As I put it in one of my chapters of the old tip book, to err is human, to correct requires sound method. And creationists are really lax on that sound method part. So correcting their own mistakes, which they do a lot of, is always tricky to do. The other area that Rupi and Sanford were bumping into in this particular section related to the first family. That turned out to be the key. The first family was the name given by Don Johanson to a particular cluster of Australopithecine remnants that were found. I think it's labeled under AL 288, something like that in the literature. And they're fragmentary fossils, and as a consequence, it's not at all sure how many of them there were. You can get minimum levels, like if you have certain kinds of teeth and certain kinds of bones that you don't have more than two of in the case of bones, or you don't have more than one of in the case of a particular tooth, or two on either side. You can use that as a way of working out the minimum number of people that had to have been there. And you can also make some guesstimations as to the maximum number. The numbers run anywhere from a couple, 4 or 5, up to like 17 or so. And it's uncertain quite how the deposit was formed. They had thought it was kind of a flood thing where they were all, a bunch were washed together, and that's why they were thinking them as a single group. But I put up a posting from 2010 by Brian Switek that did a really nice job of culling out the technical literature on what the biogeography of the place was. And as usual, it turns out to be way more interesting than the conventional flood model. The other fun part is that not a single one of the sources that Switek mentioned have so far showed up in Rupi and Sanford, even though they're writing 7 years later. So they don't seem terribly interested in the technical issues. In fact, one of the blips, the reason why I started investigating this, was the source that Rupi and Sanford were citing, and it was a Lollapalooza, because it turned out to be a 1976 article in National Geographic by Don Johanson, and it was inaccessible, unfortunately. It's a long way back. Ethiopia yields first family of early man, and it was done as an authority quote because they were saying described a nearly complete hand as being anatomically modern, indistinguishable from H. sapiens. In describing the hand bones from Hadar, Johansen observed they, quote, bear an uncanny resemblance to our own in size, shape, and function. The thumb rotates, making it possible to manipulate tools with finesse. Well, I would have liked to have seen the original text on that one. I wish, but the point is that just because something is human-like doesn't mean it's human-like as in Homo sapiens. And nothing in Johansen's work subsequent to that gives any indication that he thought this was a human hand or that anatomically it was plain. So I couldn't find out any follow-up on that. If anybody happens to have access to that old sign, I think I can probably find the back copy of it buried in some of our colleges here, but that's low on my totem pole here. Let's see what we're dealing with. It's right before Brian Stevens is calling attention to more of this information. Mentions right before angular, pre-articular, articular, quadrate units were arranged in the same way in both animals. Yanaconodon. That'd be a pretty unique set of words. Yeah, that is pretty unique. Let me see. That we're running into a mess here in terms of, in fact, trying to work out this little detail. Yep, I'll have to check out that later. Anyway, the thing about all of this stuff about the Homo sapiens and Australopithecines argument is how tendentious they are. That Rupi has to troll all the way back to a hard to track down secondary account in National Geographic for something that will sound right. Why doesn't he cite any of the technical literature on it that since then? Why doesn't he pay attention to that? Well, because it doesn't have the right authority quote. The fact of the matter is that there is no indication whatsoever that Homo sapiens, our species, anatomically modern humans, existed back at the same time as Australopithecines. Worse, it's annoying that Rupi and Sanford are leaving hidden their own chronology. They're not willing to come out because Sanford is a young Earth creationist. And he thinks that there was a literal Adam and Eve and a population bottleneck after Noah and all that stuff in the conventional young Earth creationist frame. But apparently they're not willing so far to offer any direct presentation of it. They may be proceeding, and from what I've glanced through from later on in the book, that it looks like they're taking the equivocation route of not explicitly presenting a young Earth creationist argument so that it can be generically used by any anti-evolutionist, in the same way that a lot of intelligent designers who are young Earth creationists, like Paul Nelson, will present their material without any chronological baggage attached and avoid dates much at all, so that it can be theoretically used by any branch of anti-evolutionist. Let's see. Anyway, Brian says, no biggie. It was the only unanswered question in 3 solid reads throughs. Yeah, it's, I dashed it off in 9 months. So I'm not at all surprised that the eyeballs can glaze over. That is the one advantage in doing the work with Jackson, is that we've got 2 sets of eyeballs working on the thing. And that allows us to catch typographical errors and continuity issues and the like in advance. I've already worked out the main superstructure of the book. And then we'll find out, once I get everything into the same typeface and font as the original Slam Dunk was, to find out how long it is. It's going to be biggie. And the rocks were there will certainly cover a vast amount of material. And I don't want to have to edit any of the material that we've come up with now down. But we'll find out once we got the whole shebang going. It is looking like it will be about the same number of technical sources as Slam Dunk did, so it's a couple thousand plus. I'm doing an even more thorough index this time around, which I'm again able to tackle as I'm handling the source referencing angle. Jackson's currently working on yet another chapter, and I finally finished the orphan gene matter that I inserted into chapter 4. And then there's some instances where I've taken some material and repositioned them, because as we've gained along time and new chapter concepts have worked out, as Jackson has been coordinating the various answers books that we've been dealing with, it requires rearranging some of the stuff, because we bring a topic up in one area and then we revise it in another. Yeah, Lisa for Truth is Australopithecines did not coexist with man as in Homo sapiens. Some of the later branches of them did operate in the same time frame as the very earliest of Homo, Homo habilis, and even some Homo erectus, I think, farther down the road. But it's not part of the issue about some of the authority quoting. And if you read my old Planet of the Apes chapter, you'll get a lot of the skivvy on that. Was the obsession with 2 camps. One had a basic model that there would be just one species that turns into another. It was a very sympatric model of human evolution, rather than an allopatric one where species are branching off and then one branch branches off into another branch, and you can have groups coexisting. And so your air quotes ancestor species doesn't necessarily drop dead. It continues in its own range and maybe bumping India at times. And so the single species model was a big problem. The other one was the idea that evolution, in some respects, they thought of it as way slower than we do now. So they were thinking in terms of like 10 million years back. And so they were really having trouble putting australopithecines that were occurring way later than the old slow as molasses model indicated as a base group for Homo sapiens branching out of much later through Homo erectus. All of that are debates that were really higher echelon in the 70s and 80s, but as time progressed and more fossil blips got on the scope, we have a new perspective. So we have much more of an evolutionary shrub issue than that, which of course will bring us up to the second topic on whether or not a third of all biologists are now doubting Darwinism, which is the jaw dropper that's popping up in there. All of this relates to that map of time issue. Oh, I use the phrase all the time, and I hope other people will make use of it. I have a reason for using the terminology that I do as mnemonics to make it easy to remember concepts. Origins or bust is another that is referring to that obsession with, well, where did life come from? Where did the universe come from? Where did fill in the blank come from? Rather than thinking about other stuff. Map of time simply relates to, what do you think happened? That's a chronological thing. And when do you think it happened? And what happened before and what happened next? In order to work out a clear map of time in your head, you got to get the chronology. You have to understand deep time. In the case of geology, you're going to be bumping into radiometric dating issues. You're going to be or taphonomy and biogeography. All of these are side issues that connect up with that conceptualization of what you think happened. And Lisa for Truth asked if I watched Mr. Atheist. I think I have a bit. With 18,000 balls on my plate, I can't keep up with absolutely everybody. I try to catch a few of the video postings. Obviously, Jackson's material and Trey the Explainer. I bump into some of his stuff. He's awfully good. Potholer can be fascinating material. And so it's a juggling act as to which ones I deal with, because a video is, although often very entertaining and compelling, and you can sometimes listen to it. Other things, if they're presenting visuals and the like, you got to watch it. And so it can be a time-consuming thing to process that information in addition to all the other stuff that I've been doing, which is a lot. The goal with the new book is to be as rigorous as possible and as up-to-date as possible. So literally, I'm finding new technical literature, and Jackson is the same way, that's bearing on the various points that we bring up. So I want the book to be as bulletproof as possible and as up-to-date, so that anybody who does have a technical mind won't feel like, well, boy, this is just rather boring and lower level. No, they're going to be challenged at, wow, I didn't know that. Ooh, that's neat. Yeah, I got to look that one up. That kind of thing I want to spark, no matter how high are you up in the technical food chain, which is why I was pleased with how Slam Dunk worked out, because professional paleontologist Christine Janis was finding out information that she had not been aware of in her own area that I managed to bump into because I was looking up other side issues and the like. So just to give you a measure, in my tip work, I'm covering some works from about 1900 technical journals, and that means it's physically impossible for me to cover it. Lisa Petru says one third of which scientists? Supposedly biologists. Yeah, while we're waiting, hopefully Jackson may be entering the show after a little bit. So you can make use of all those various links. I highly recommend reading that Switek people on Who Killed the Hominids. It's like a murder mystery in advance, and it's looking like that first family was never a family, that they were isolated bits. They were probably killed by regular predators. There wasn't even much in the way of floodish, like river channel kinds of stuff, deposits. It turns out to be taphonomically very different, and you can follow up on the various sources they list. But about the biologist end, we've got it came to me, I think, because it was linked by another creationist online that I wasn't aware of. And it's why 1/3 of biologists now question Darwinism. In that noted science journal, The Federalist, which is a right-wing, hyper-conservative bunch, This fellow, Brian Dierker, a young guy, I don't see him in any other apologetics, so he's kind of right off the start. It says he's a law student at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. That's putting him in the department right off the bat. He holds a master's degree in public administration and a bachelor's degree in economics, both from Texas A&M University. He's a Christian and a Texan and loves to talk about both. And what he apparently is very good at is siphoning intelligent design arguments without bothering to fact check much about them. Mutable asks, RJ, explain something to me. How do creationists reconcile genetic entropy with speciation? They don't, in the short. Genetic entropy, which we're going to have a whole section on in the new book, and both Jackson Weed and I have bumped into the issue repeatedly with Standing for Truth in our debates with him, is the idea that supposedly there's a deterioration going on in the genome that it can be measured, supposedly, that's happening so fast that no amount of natural selection can compensate for it, and therefore everything is going to hell in a handbasket, deteriorating since Noah and the flood. And Sanford and his various groupies, George Carter and Nathaniel Jensen and a few others, orbit this genetic entropy world where they're insisting it's the case. In terms of speciation, the actual speciation literature and individual species, anti-evolutionists don't get within a mile of most of that, and certainly Sanford doesn't. So they've never even tried to really apply it with the available genetic information in relation to speciation issues. They're kind of facing an opposite area, that if genetic entropy were true, and Jackson Wheats pointed this out as well, that if genetic entropy were true, organisms would be deteriorating so quickly that we would be able to detect it all over the place in their genomes, and we don't. So that's a mess. Speciation is the major conceptual block among all anti-evolutionists. And therefore, anybody that wants to dive into anti-evolution issues, if you're up on the speciation matter, you're miles ahead of them. You have to understand that speciation is not like a light switch that suddenly flips from one species to another. There's zygotic isolation mechanisms, that you have a population of male and female in sexually reproducing organisms, and it's gradually fissioning off a speciation event in which segments of the population won't interbreed with other segments of the population. And this can be differential, to where females will start being isolated from certain members of the male side, but not the other way around, where the males can still boink with any of the females, or vice versa. There are multiple modes that can happen in this area, and they've studied this in excruciating detail with those fast breeding, randy little Drosophila fruit flies. So an awful lot of the literature relates to that. In fact, an awful lot of genetic information is related to Drosophila because they're relatively compact and can be dealt with in a lab, and you can genotype them relatively easily. And they're very speciose as well. I think something like 70% of all the fruit fly species exist in just Hawaii, that they were like speciation heaven, because they apparently got there first and had the place all to themselves for a while. So that isolation issue and that biogeographical thing and bottleneck issues, those are all part of it. Hybridization zones also enter in because of the mitochondria that have their own proprietary DNA, and that can act as brakes on speciation events or nudges in other directions. And I've forgotten his name, starts with an S, Sutherland or something like that. Has done work on Pacific Northwest chipmunks that show how intricate the zones are. In order to understand the speciation events, you have to take into account their mitochondria as well as their nuclear DNA. Needless to say, you're not going to find anything on this over in genetic entropy creationism land, that they're 900 miles away from that data field. Let's see. Brian Stevens, it's a mutable destiny. Sorry to be pedantic, but the process never stops, so it doesn't really repeat. Speciation isn't an iterative process. There's nothing that says a species needs to generate a new species at all, or that its species need to be notably different from when you work off a geographic isolation. So that's what happens when you deal with relatively stagnant groups like coelacanths that are not changeless. They're not the same species as the ones that were around 60 million years ago, but they look a lot like them. There's probably a lot going on, and there has been a lot going on under the surface in their biology, but surface details are a different matter. And speciation, in fact, can involve virtually no genetic change at all. You can have animals where there's just a slight tweak in the time of day that they make sex. And that now isolates a segment of the population that are almost identical in every possible respect except what time of day they're boinking. And so you can theoretically fission off a species that way that now can become isolated from its other group, because when they're ready to be randy, the other species has already done it. And so they don't need to breed anymore. Lisa Pritchard says, well, aren't lampreys the same? Well, lampreys are at the very base of the chordates, and I must say I am not terribly familiar with their sexual practices, so I'm going to have to beg off on that one. Maybe if Jackson gets in here, he'll have the skivvy on lamprey sex. I know he looked into a little bit, in fact did a video on it on request on whale sex, and it's an absolutely fascinating little process. That's another area, I suppose, where religious creationists are at a philosophical and emotional disadvantage, because sex is like, ooh, the forbidden thing. And the idea that birds do it, bees do it, even educated fleas do it, that's the driver of evolution. And so they don't really want to think about that. They want to keep the clothes around it, and make sure, you don't expose your ankle, madam. What are you, libertine? So there's a certain prudishness to it. And they can maybe they'll go berserk if they go over to fungi. They have one of the most convoluted sexual systems you could imagine. We vertebrates are downright boring. Brian Stevens says, I don't know about the sex, but there being 38 known extant species of lampreys would say it's a variant. Although 38 species ain't a hell of a lot. Although not bad by vertebrate standards. Remember, our genus only has at the moment one species in it. All the other ones have disappeared. But even at their height, probably we're talking no more than half a dozen or so at any given time at the heyday. Altogether, mammals have only about 2,000 or 3,000 species, relatively minor. But insects, yipes, they can have family groups with tens of thousands of species in them. So we're dull in that respect. Bats, they've got 1,200 species in some 20 odd families. So it all depends on your point of view. It could be argued that animals that can fly have some dispersal and interaction dynamics with their environment that may be a driver. It's probably no coincidence that the most speciose insects, if somebody who's an insect group, he can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but everything from beetles and of course ants have a flying stage involved. They're not terrestrial in terms of their mating queens. And that animals that fly tend to be more speciose than terrestrial bound ones. Puffalophagus asks, have the anti-evolution folks figured out yet that crows hold funerals and teach faces to recognize to their children that have yet to encounter that threat? Overall, the technical literature on animal consciousness and animal behavior, and also the genetics and neuroscience of consciousness and awareness and all that in general, is a topic that's almost invisible in the anti-evolutionist canon. That's one of the things I keep track of in measuring. So the answer shortly is that no, they haven't figured that out. And it's exceedingly unlikely that they ever will. You get a little bit of gee whizism that where they'll say, oh, how wonderful the animals are that can do these amazing things. So there's that quality. But drawing the inferences of what it means for a air quotes bird brain to be able to do very intricate and complex social behavior, and maybe even feeling grief and concern and affection and all of these things that we associate with our lofty bipedal organism itself, is stuff that has implications for the nature of mind. And there's a natural disinclination of the anti-evolutionists to venture too far into that, because the last thing they want to do is blur the boundary between us and the animals. So they want to keep us on the pinnacle, and everything else has to be, they're just animals. But it turns out that there's very little about our behavior that's truly unique. And I've said before, as a working hypothesis, that it looks like that the only thing that makes us truly unique is that we have an unusual combination of skills, neither one of which are themselves unique. And that is, we're the tool-making species that tell stories. We've got tool-making species. Jackson just alerted me that he's on the way home, so we can hope to get him in on the show fairly shortly. There are tool-making species. Crows can do that, and chimpanzees make rudimentary tools and so forth, but apparently none of them are species as tale tellers. We've got cetaceans that may very well tell tales to one another, but they don't make tools. They don't have hands to do that. The grasping appendages required to make needles and such like. And so we are the species that have that as a weird combination. And then a major driver is the fact that we tell our tales with a grammatical language that allows us to create a whole new layer of social interaction that a non-speaking, non-verbal species can't. They can have rudimentary basic calls and things like that, but the ability to tell nasty things about your fellow organism and build up reputations into, Trumpian behavior is apparently something that only we humans can do. For good or ill, and we can also do good things as well. So Brian Stevens, crows also commit murder. They even have gang behaviors. Well, I think the name for a group of crows is a murder of crows or murder of ravens or something like that. There's all sorts of strange connotations on that. We know chimpanzees can engage in war. The basic chimpanzee, the bonobos are make sex not war, so they have a very different dynamic about it. And mama will make it feel so much better. Okay, now go out and get a mate. That's their approach to things. Let me stop at the moment while we're waiting for Jackson to show up, and let us thank the Patreons, some of who are in the room here, Puffalophagus and the like. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let me get my little screen share on here. The weekly ritual of watching RJ hunt for the damned. There we go. We want the application window. We put that over there and that over there. And there are patrons. Every one of you, my latest Patreon deposit has just hit my bank account. And believe you me, it is much appreciated. Every increment up makes things more and more comfortable, to where I have to triage less and less, to where I don't have to decide whether it's between food and or ink and or paying this bill, and which ones I have to jump to the next part of the month and all that kind of stuff. For the last few months, I've been able to actually keep ahead in terms of printing stuff, because everything that I can physically do some hard copy on allows me to sort and keep track of information way better than simply dumping it in a pending file. And I'm gradually kind of whittling at some of that when I hit particular authors and discover that some of them are already in my pending file. I can also print the first page up of that and move them over into the finished text. Anyway, that's a window into the grinding world of Downardian scholarship. Anyway, I will thank Hendril and Eric and Cyrus, the colleagues at researcher level. We've got Travis and Keith and Fino and Puffalophagus and Brad and Ralph and Meet Convert Me and Palogia and Sur, and then assistant researchers Dyer and Duranko and James and Nana and Benjamin and Sun Sky Stone and Totas Real, and our friends Daniel and Eat Meal, who has the HAL 9000 answering machine that I did for him, and Stephen and Marigale and Insects Are Cool, and Daniel and Morton and Bo and Staggles and Alex and Paul and Zeshi, and legacy patrons Jen and Jody and John and Andrew and Yui and Mona and Everett. Every one of you that has contributed to this in any way, shape, or form at whatever level are all part of and very much benefiting the whole project. You recognize that what's happening here is new and it's worthwhile, and there's something about it that needs to be helped because nobody else is doing it, and we can go ahead and do that. So I thank you all, and here is the wordpress.com. Again, I have the links on that in the main description, so everybody that watches the video can see it as well. And there's how you can become a Patreon. And then also the GoFundMe.com is still up and available. Also, people can do recurring things there as well. So there's various avenues. I know I'm a newbie on the block in terms of all this Patreon thing and self-financing and volunteer financing, but it's how we venture into things. I'm technically speaking a retiree. Oh, Jackson's here. I'm technically speaking a retiree who is embarking on a whole new midlife crisis in my 60s. Sometimes it's been bumpy in terms of finances and the like, and the Patreon has made that way less bumpy. But at the same time, I love what I'm doing, and I hope all of you realize and share the degree of enthusiasm that I have. I'm not doing this as some grinding way of making wealth. If I were, I would become a creationist evangelical and start lying to my teeth about Noah's Ark, and maybe I could get a whole slew of people helping me on that. Ken Ham brings down $150,000 a year plus every year, and nobody can ever accuse him of doing sound scholarship. But if he enjoys himself a third as much as I do when I'm doing my work, he's still behind me on that. So, hi, Jackson. A little bit scratchy on the audio. I think you may have to get a better connection. If you're driving home on that, wait until you get home and get on your home access computer and all that. So anyway, that was the exciting world of shameless plug and the whole point of that. And I want everybody to know that I am not special in what you can do in the way of source methods. I didn't invent it. Jackson was coming up into the same direction himself. Paulo was doing that in spades on his own. And then I'm upping everybody's game, hopefully. And I'm trying to get more and more of the people who do criticize creationists to embark on that source methods direction. I think there are some I'll have to be a little critical of. I think Aaron Ra is an example of somebody that avoids source methods questions. He doesn't dive down to that level. He's brilliant on data field and philosophy. That's an area he comes at. But at every point, when you're engaging with somebody who is presenting a fallacious argument, part of your discussion should be a detailing of how they have constructed their arguments, what sources they have relied on, and why their usage of those sources is invalid and inappropriate. Pavlovka says, I'm a colleague here now. You got to fix the slide. I will indeed. I keep track of all of these things bit by bit as I bounce back and forth. I haven't checked my emails today. I dived immediately when I got up into working on the Menton section, the vestigial matter that it's been growing deliciously, because David Menton was making a lot of very bold claims that were really flimsy if you started looking at his lack of documentation on them about the vestigial organ issue. And just how bad it was came into the fore when I tracked down this old 1893 biology book that was alluded to in passing by Menton. And apparently he never bothered to read it closely, because he would have discovered that, oh, no, Wittersheim back in 1893 was way farther ahead than you're implying. And it turned out to be quite an education on that. So I've been restructuring things, because Jackson, in many ways, approaches these issues the way I was doing in my old tip work, which would be to take somebody's argument and pull it apart and look at each segment and explain why each element of it's wrong. I'm now I come at it from a slightly different perspective now, where I'm looking at the thematic components. So I'm taking the same elements and instead saying this actually could fit better here. So we'll still be dealing with all of the pieces, but the order in which we present them will have a slightly different structure, so that then you hit at the right point for the top of the arc where you've said, well, we've now dealt with Menton, boop, and then we move on to the next point. So that's the plan on there. The thing that I want everybody to do who watches me, and connecting up with everybody who you know, and have them connect up with everybody they know, is to internalize source methods as a natural go-to way of approaching every problem, and certainly when you're dealing with wackaloons, creationists, anti-vaxxers, and all of that. Because everything that was difficult and laborious about source methods 15 or 20 years ago is mouse clicks fast in the 21st century. Because we have access to primary source data, we can look up topics and Google search stuff, and Wikipedia as a way of putting us onto a trail. It's not a destination. But, oh, how are you doing, Mr. Scratchy? Yeah, you're still coming across as electrostatic charge. It's the gods are not smiling upon you, Jackson. Yeah, he must have a terrible. There's a lot of problems that he gets. I don't know whether they've got sporadic cell service down there, or internet connections, or poor, 0.5G instead of 4G. I don't know what the dynamics are down there, but there have been dropouts that I've seen in Jackson. I don't. Once in a while, it'll happen up in here, but I've been relatively lucky, knock on wood, that I've had comparatively few little glitch outs on things. Brian, we're getting stuff about otters here, about the 11 articles I found on how terrible otters are. They all with a sea otter, not freshwater otters now, I'm wondering. The otters popped up in a bunch of areas because Nathaniel Jensen at one point falsely thought that North American river otters lived in Hawaii. And so there is example of one of the things that I'm instilling in Jackson, hopefully, and in everybody that follows source methods, is don't take people's word for stuff, even stuff that seems innocuous, especially if it lacks a reference. That don't assume they're right. They can goof up, and sometimes spectacularly obvious goofs can be sitting there literally right in front of you, where if you don't look them up, you find out, uh-oh. So I never trust what the creationist has to say. And because I've had way too much of an experience from Dwayne Gish on, that often stuff that seems the most innocuous as background data points are seriously wrong. Well, oh gosh, I have to get back to 1/3 of biologists now question Darwinism issues. That Denise O'Leary bumped me onto it. I follow her on Twitter, and she may want to block me if I keep doing these sorts of things, but aha!
Can you hear me?
Yes, we are now getting you. You were getting teleporter static and that before.
Okay. I don't know what was going on with that. I had to switch to my... I'm using the microphone Savannah got me. I had to plug in. Anyways, the example about the how easy source methods is now. For anyone wondering, we had to track down a single claim in Ariel Roth's 98 book, which led us to a 1968 paper, which led us to a 1915 paper, all of which was available full text on the internet.
I mean, I go, wow, because some of these things are so incredibly obscure. You're going, oh, I'm never going to find this. Oh, wait a minute. And then what do we discover? That Ariel Roth has made up numbers.
Yeah, he takes... One of his arguments was he took a number which was a maximum, not an average, but it was a maximum for a single section of a particular reef, and said, what if all reefs grew at this rate?
Yeah, like, he's just riffed and muddled. And then Whitmire, the other creationist, was simply repeating, cherry-picking the worst numbers that Roth provided, of which the numbers that Roth provided weren't right.
All right, and the number, the number that he provided was the low end. We couldn't even find. He said the coral growth rate was between 26 and 44 centimeters per year. but we could never find the 44. We could find at max the 26.
Ooh, Lisa asks a really good question. Why do they use such outdated material? There are several elements to that. One is that they've come up studying obscure material secondarily that was relying on still older material. So they're feeding off of a daisy chain of argument without necessarily seeing the original material, by the way. They can build some of this stuff directly that way. In other cases, it's one that they were pioneers in a field, and so there's a foggier aspect to older work that wouldn't be the case in more recent stuff. Andrew Snelling would be relying on some 1850s account of a particular deposit, and I would go, like, there's been no work since. And I discovered there was work since. And why aren't you noticing it? You have to wonder about that. In this coral case, it's hard to tell what got Roth tracking back that far other than some of the secondary material that he was glomming onto, because some of this stuff was alluded to in the secondary sources that were a bit more recent. So it was probably a matter of cherry picking, but how he jumped off the cliff with this number, it doesn't matter whether he saw the original or not. You know, he's not representing the data correctly. So there is this tendency to simply catch whatever you can. In another case that I mentioned occasionally, where Steve Austin did an article, short piece with this Hutch guy, and they cited a particular technical paper that was in an anthology. And when I tried to track it down, this was from like the fairly recent 1990s. And when I tried to track it down, I discovered that the anthology was never printed, and therefore there was no article. What did they get out of this? And then I contacted the supposed author, who knew nothing what the hell of what this was about. And so that meant that somebody along the way in their network was riffing off of some account that maybe they saw something on at some conference, but never wrote the notes down correctly. And then that got copied through and eventually filtered into the thing, but neither Hutch nor Austin thought to fact check it before they referenced it. So they ended up citing a non-existent source on a non-existent topic.
That is pretty funny. One of the very first, I think maybe the very first time I asked you to source methods approach a claim was the one I found at the Gem and Mineral convention here in Shreveport. The lady who had the little poster that said the average dinosaur was the size of a sheep, which came from Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park, cited by Ken Ham. So
and so you get these things that sometimes verbal things are awkwarder to deal with than written text. Although you can get functionally written texts in video presentations, the poster that's put up as part of the PowerPoint. That's how I nailed Kent Hovind on his Harun Yaya addiction, was because he typed it so accurately that I was able to track down exactly the article that uniquely he got it from. There's no place on earth that long string of text would have occurred other than that Harun Yaya post. So those things where you can search out particular quotes with ellipses, I've mentioned that before. Source citations.
Oh boy, ellipses are fun.
You can type out. Oh yeah, they should always be a flag for you. If anybody uses an ellipsis, including us, that make us. Oh, what was in between? You know, and that should be a spur to investigate. Because if you're a bad scholar, you're often using the ellipsis to cover up the parts you don't want to talk about.
Yeah, what was it? Georgia Purdom used a little ellipsis because she was quoting a paper on gene duplications, but the paper, she was using the paper to say, or to make it seem as though this paper was saying gene duplication in its totality didn't happen. What the paper was actually saying was that the old model of gene duplication that we had was incomplete, and that they needed to add some data points to it. But her ellipsis cut out the relevant information.
Yeah, that would be also the case of what you'll be seeing on this 1/3 of biologists question Darwinism. That the guy in question that wrote the original article, this Dirker, is just repeating stuff. He talks about a controversial letter to Nature in 2014 signaled a mounting concern. Well, I put a link into the damn thing. It's a perfectly fine discussion going on between the kind of Evo-Devo, I can't call them ideologues, they're perfectly fine biologists, but they have a different focus as to how they want to connect up the incoming data field. And the more traditionalist biologists say it's all fascinating, wonderful work, but it doesn't invalidate the big picture of what neo-Darwinism refers to. And it's in many cases just a nomenclatural thing. That's why whenever you see one of these debates, you want to figure out what exactly is being disputed here. Is any of them arguing that the evidence doesn't support natural common descent? No. Are they arguing that it's some non-natural phenomenon? No. Is it suggesting that there are things other than merely protein sequences in structural genes that affect things? Well, duh. We've known that for decades. Cis-regulatory levels and then ecological interactions and epigenetic factors. All of this stuff enters into that. But does that mean that it isn't still natural? And so what you always have to be clear as to what they're talking about. Every one of the authors on those in that letter, oh, this incendiary controversial, no. The same thing with that conference that was going on over in Britain recently. Royal Society, I think, had a bit, and some of the papers have already been put out open access, and this may be reflecting some of the things that went into it. If you're going to try to argue that there's some great controversy here, be sure to have read the works of the people who have signed the letter or made the discussion. Don't go on little authority blips, especially if you're trying to trawl through Denise O'Leary stuff or Evolution News postings on it. No, that's a secondary source. Read their original work. And I've read virtually everybody that's on these lists as the supposed Darwinism doubters. No, they aren't. Read their work.
I was reading a little bit of Denton's book, Evolution. What is it? Evolution, Theory in Crisis.
Still in crisis.
But what's funny is, I was kind of puzzling over his sort of presentation of the history of evolutionary thought, at least in the latter half of the 20th century, because he seems to be implying that every time something new is discovered, that's a diss on Darwin somehow, or evolution.
Yeah. And
I don't think it makes sense.
The thing that's so striking about Denton is how nowhere Denton is. If you read the 1985 book Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, and then Nature's Destiny in 98, and then finally he just doesn't want to give up typology, so he comes back to it, not quite with a vengeance, in Evolution, a Theory Still in Crisis. You still don't know what the hell he thinks. There's no map of time there. He doesn't know what he thinks happens. He only knows it mustn't be neo-Darwinism. No, mustn't be neo-Darwinism. And I had the delight, because everybody who's got Slam Dunk will remember how I've ripped Denton to shreds over this damn reptile mammal transition section that he's got, to where he's just so obtuse on the point. And not understanding he was arguing that you couldn't have, there was no sign of any Darwinian adaptive scenario for the jaw transition. Yes, there was, and they've been done decades ago. So it's not even in a news bulletin. And when I confronted him on this point in just last year, when he did a speech for one of his new videos on why water is godly or something like that. That water is providential, that the reason why it's there, that he's got this weird providential Panglossian view of all of the fundamentals, why the balances of elements are so perfectly tuned. So it's like a fine-tuning argument on steroids. But I asked him about this reptile mammal transition matter and argued that no, there was a Darwinian scenario for it. And why didn't you mention this in your book? Didn't you know about it? And he just kind of harumphed and fluffed and didn't disagree with me. And it's like when you're trying to, the reaction I was getting from him is if you were starting to ask Ben Carson about the grain silos of the pyramids. That it would be just this kind of nods his head and doesn't really disagree with you, but doesn't really discuss anything either, and just wants to move beyond. And that's as far as you can get with Denton. Well, he's had 30 years to figure this out.
Yeah, I was reading a paper, one of the papers that we actually cited in my video on structuralism, or the video on structuralism, and part of the paper is he mentions discontinuous types. So it would sound really like Barrowman's if you ask me. But
Yeah.
regardless, but you're right. It's a question of it's a map of time. Did arthropods or vertebrates evolve from non-arthropods or non-vertebrates?
Is anything related to anything? And are the things that aren't related to anything, how do they come about and when? And all of that's map of time issue. And it's not that anti-evolutionists have troubles dealing with those data fields. They don't deal with those data fields. And the only area that sort of kind of tries are the young earth creationist baraminologists. I mean, you got to give them props, A, for effort. They actually are trying to work out, but they have to. They're forced by those bottlenecks of the creation event with Adam and Eve, period, and then the Noah's flood bottleneck. They got two of them. They have to work this out. They can't waffle. Whereas the intelligent designers they have infinite amount of time. They've got billions of years for that just to dissipate as a fog of, anomalocarids. They just can't. You find the same thing occurring when they discuss the Cambrian phyla. One of the questions that I try to force everybody back onto the map of time is I'll say, do you claim or deny that anything alive today is directly descended from the Cambrian phyla animals? And you get cricket silence. Why? Because none of the people in the intelligent design movement have ever thought that problem through. So they don't have an opinion about it. They don't realize that if you're talking about chordates in the Cambrian, those are our phylum. How did we as chordates develop from them? If we did not develop from Pikaia or Cathymeris or Hycoella or any of those ones back in the Cambrian, then to call them our phyla is a meaningless distinction. They're as alien to us as Jar Jar Binks or cacti would be. So they're not realizing that the very discussion in modern phylogenetics of what a phylum is talking about everything in that phylum as related by natural common descent. And if they want to dispute that, fine, but they got to deal with the data. And as we can see from somebody at Michael Denton level, who has some scientific credentials, after all, he's been published in Nature magazine, writing actual articles.
Yeah, he's a biochemist.
Years.
Yeah.
Right. That he can't get there because there's no there to get. They're never going to make sense of this data field. The baraminologists can't do it either. Oh boy, I don't think anybody has an inkling of how deeply we're going into baraminology compared to everybody else.
Oh yeah, it's that is something. But that is kind of both of our wheelhouses. That is literally the thing I am going into just on my own side as my career. We both are reading phylogenetic stuff a lot, and so to see their honestly pathetic attempts to put the data together or chop it into pieces, it's kind of sad. But I like the instance of one of I think my favorite part of the whole baraminology chapter was when Leitner said that morphology does not correlate with genetics, and she cited that one paper. It's like basically the point of the paper was hooves evolved twice. That was literally it. Hooves, the even hoof mammals and the odd hoof mammals had separate origins.
Yeah,
cool.
And on this, we're supposed to accept their creationist argument. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. That's a pretty hard little hoof to rest on. Leitner is a really intriguing case. I first spotted her in detail in her deliciously evasive attempt to work out how many bird kinds there were. And I'm pretty sure that's the one that the Ark Encounter built off of, because their number of bird kinds is suspiciously close to the one that came up in Leitner's paper. So I figured that's it, although we've never been able to find the reading list of where their kinds come up with. And the fact that I think there's a Cassiid in the Ark encounter. Well, guess who has done the only baraminology paper on the therapsids? That's on the Cassiids. So bingo. So there, you got to give Ark encounter a few points for kind of paying attention to the cutting edge baraminology work. What they don't recognize is how they're shooting their foot off every single moment with it, because of their evasions on the things, like the implication that terrestrial cetaceans are on board the Ark, and that presumably then all the whales developed in like 1,000 years or so after that.
I mean, I mean, you know, in some respects I can understand it, because all of the baraminologists are on the AIG payroll, so I can
or
kind of
interact with them.
Right.
Some of them work through ICR. They're all, it's a small club. There's an awful lot of overlap there. Most of the people that show up publishing in Creation Science Quarterly and Institute for Creation Research of venues, and then Answers in Genesis, there are several different journals in there. It's a small club. Remember, there's only some 30 or 40 young Earth creationist fact claimants. That's not a big bunch. So the idea that they're not going to be dipping in whatever little venues are available in the air quotes peer-reviewed literature of creationism, no, that's not surprising at all.
We really do. For anyone who reads baraminology or would like to, we go extremely in depth on it. We compare a large number of their papers and their different methods, like cognitum and hybridization.
Oh God, I love the cognitum. Cognitum is just a razzle-dazzle word for, like, this is what people think.
That's
so, you know,
it.
we decided that we can't have these as the same kind, even though our baraminology analysis suggests they should be, because people really don't think of them as the same kind. That's literally their argument.
I mean, for anyone who doesn't take that seriously, that is literally what they say.
Yeah, we're not joking.
It is what the instance of the Bovidae. Sheep and cows are both within Bovidae, the family of cows. Yeah. The thing is, Gene Leitner says that sheep and cows can't be the same kind, or at least probably aren't, because people tend to think of sheep and cows as kind of different.
Yeah, I think is the way I put in the phrase that they were trying to treat it as if that this was a People's Choice Awards for systematics, you know?
Yeah, maybe they should, you know, consult their Ouija board or something like that.
Yeah, and there are quite a few spots in the whole book, and the baraminology section had some of them, where basically we've got like one paragraph sentences where we're going, what? What's that? Are you serious?
Yeah, yeah, a couple of times. One of the examples is where they classify the kind, the hybridization data stops at, the blastocyst, if I remember.
Oh yeah, correctly. They arbitrarily decide that it's at that level. The cherry picking of this is absolutely. Oh, Lisa for Truth says, how do they account for whales being mammals? Oh, give that one a whack, Jackson.
Well, for them, it's not really ever explained why there is a twin-nested hierarchy, why crocodiles and lizards and turtles, which are all separate baramins, have all the same characters. That's never really an issue discussed.
Yeah, and the thing with whales is, I think there's been practically no work on cetaceans at the baraminology level.
I didn't see any from our analysis.
But you do get basically the grumpy cat thing, where they mustn't allow there being any transitionals. So they've got pachycetids and all these ones, not really whales. They're not whale ancestors. In fact, one of the things I put up when you were bringing up some additional material on the cetaceans, and that they're basically just arbitrarily disallowing everything after that. Because you've got the things, well, they arbitrarily define whaleness as, well, they got to have a blowhole and they've got to have a fluke tail and all. Well, those are all highly derived features. We've got enough fossils now that we can see that the earliest whales didn't use flukes, that the earliest whales didn't have a blowhole. They had the snout further forward. And you can see in the fossils, the snout, the nari is moving backwards over time, as clearly adaptive stuff is going on.
Oh, yeah.
But they just don't allow that. So they'll leave out the middle so that they can have an isolated not whale over here and then pure whale over here, but they just leave the middle part out. In the same way that the middle between Australopithecines and Homo sapiens has to be either removed or parsed to the side. But that parting of the waters for there's that chart that was done back in 2005 or whatever, analyzing the contradictory positions that creationists, sometimes the same creationists that change their mind on the same fossil. Sometimes it's a human, sometimes it's an ape. And then I've added on some additional material for our book that have shown that this process hasn't ended with Sediba and all the rest. They just can't make up their damn minds what these things are.
Yeah. Yeah. It's for instance, like with regard to the whales, Zygoriza, which is one of the early truly marine cetaceans, does not have a blowhole. The nostril is about halfway up the snout. Because you've got like Pakicetus who has and Ambulocetus with the nostril at the tip of the snout. But as they became more marine, it migrated upwards.
And another little detail, I think Carl Zimmer noted it in his book, At the Water's Edge. So I strongly recommend everything of Zimmer, but that would be a particular one on this point. I think he brought it up that there's an argument that could be made that the artiodactyls from whom these whales are developing from had a good knack for breath holding and breathing through the nose rather than the mouth.
Well, sure.
That is an adaptation that's pre-adapting them to what eventually becomes the blowhole thing.
Sure. I think they were living. I think one of the analysis said that they're living like crocodiles. The early ones are. So yeah, sure, I can see that.
Yeah, the big dynamic you can see between, for one thing, the way the tail is configured, is that whereas the reptiles and fish all swim like this, whales swim like this. They undulate up and down. And that's why eventually they don't have to worry about using the rear tails. The whales didn't stay with what we would think of as the flipper paddle plesiosaur approach, which uses the limbs as propulsion mechanism. You get a bigger kick by using that tail thing. And because of the way the back arches in mammals, that's why you get that motion.
Yep. But, who cares about all of that?
The fiddly little details, yeah. And whatever possessed this clever designer to stick tooth enamel genes on baleen whales.
Yeah, or even more interestingly, to make whales with part baleen and part teeth, like Chonocetus and Artiocetus.
Oh, Puffalovagus goes sneaky here. Do whales technically have a cloaca? I don't know.
No, I don't think so. No, I don't.
I defer to your matter on that.
They have they have internal genitalia, but it's still separated.
Yeah. It would be nice if we had living examples of every single fossil of the lineage leading to whales. We'd tell a lot. It'd be wonderful if we had all the DNA on that. But the thing is that the creationist needs to think about this stuff. If they were to get in their magic time machine and go back to see that particular taxa, what would they have seen? What by their model would we have seen? If they're claiming they're design events, what would a design event look like if you were there to watch it with all of your science equipment? And literally no anti-evolutionist ever thinks about that.
RJ, it was a tornado and the animals just came out of it. Remember?
Yes, we've seen that in that wonderful Genesis video where these tornadoes and vaguely cat-like animals are dropping out, and then of course we have our ballistic koalas being shot out to Australia that way, and then of course all of those incredible ecosystems living in the floating forests of the pre-Carboniferous coal seams that Todd Wood plays around with. I mean, it sounds like stuff that you would be making up for a Saturday Night Live skit. But this stuff is being passed off as science in the creationism side. And you're going, what?
Yeah, it's sometimes I really do honestly think sometimes that we give them too much credit. And then I remember that at least a third of Americans are creationists.
Yeah, of that stripe, yeah. And we bump into them all the time on this. Oh, by the way, if you look up that Dierker piece at the Federalist, you'll see some commentaries by yours truly. because there was this
Oh, boy.
particular creationist, Joe Morricone, who I was bumping into in the comments section, and he's apparently a pseudonym for somebody else. Some people down the road said they'd encountered this guy under various names in various contexts. But anyway, he and I just went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on this incredibly obtuse thing that he was railing on about technical articles that he was insisting somehow were a problem for evolution. Just think of coal on steroids. I know that's hard to imagine.
About coal.
but Morricone was in that level. And anyway, you'll be able to see, because I wouldn't let him have the last word on this stuff until quite a ways down the road, where it was clear that he ain't going to be able to progress to discussing any data field. And I put forward my argument clearly. And so now it's just a matter of him going, yeah, you stupid. And that's kind of a waste of time. But anyway, that if you have a bit too much time on your hands, want to go reading through that, you can see the various back and forths that we had on that reveals precisely two things. One is that this air quotes intelligent design writer at the main article never weighed in on any of these things. So either he didn't bother noticing, it's entirely possible he just gave no interest whatsoever, to the fact that blatant young earth creationists were riffing off of this material. And that's that part of that symbiotic relationship that young earth creationism have with intelligent design, where they're able to suck aspects of it for their arguments, whereas they never get pushback, whereas no intelligent design advocate, I mean zero, has ever publicly criticized any statement from any young earth creation. Oh, and by the way, Jackson, have you had a chance to look through the Orphans in the Storm section yet?
I started looking through it, and it's interesting from what I'd seen.
Yeah,
I was like a page into it.
It grew like Topsy, much larger than I had originally anticipated because of that Nelson Buggs piece and following up. And then I discovered that Cornelius Hunter had shot his mouth off on orphan genes on related topics. So it all came together as a giant arc that you've only got really three main side swipes: Nelson's arguments, and then Hunter's little side swipe, and then the stuff from that got me started on it was Jeffrey Tompkins, and all of them do not acquit themselves well in this.
That is true. Yeah, they're the way we have that chapter structured is we look at three creationists primarily, or we use them as kind of test cases. But then we have different topics kind of split between them. Like, for instance, with Jeffrey Tompkins, we have the orphans, but we also have the chromosome 2 matter. For Sanford, Sanford really only has his one shtick, which is genetic entropy.
Of course, Nathaniel Jensen sucks into that orbit as well. There's an awful lot of people that have not been taken to task quite at the same level that we've been doing. Oh, Puffaluffica says, apparently the flat earth is where Ken Ham's cup runneth over. The young earth creationists have a very ambivalent position on flat earth. For one thing, flat earthers are just as wackaloon believers as they are. They're typically young earth creationist geocentrists. And the fact even the geocentrists are a problem. There's nothing more hilarious than reading Kent Hovind criticizing geocentrism and flat earth.
RJ, is this our references so far? This almost 200-page paper that you sent me?
I sent you the chapter 4 and then the answers chapter, which is just the current reference bibliography, because there were enough sources listed in the new orphans section that I wanted you to be able to see them, so you could track down and take a look and go, "Ooh, that's interesting. I didn't know that." Yes, our bibliography is going to be adequate.
It is. This is like almost 200 pages. Jeez Louise.
Yeah, it once again. Well, that's in 10-point pitch, so that'll shrink down a bit when we put it into the finished text. But never, I guesstimate already it's in the 2,000 plus range in terms of sources. We've been accumulating a lot, and there's still a lot.
And we're not even done yet. We're not there.
Yeah, it's going to be a juicy work. I think it's going to be a worthwhile addition to the literature, and there's going to be an awful lot of anti-evolutionists that aren't going to like what we're going to say about them.
That's very true. Yeah. Oh my goodness. The chapter I actually just started. I just finished. Thank goodness, I was so tired of him. Whitmore. I finally finished his chapter on as the first section of dodging geology, which is the current one I'm working on. He takes a whole bunch of different little arguments to try to show that the Earth is young, but he doesn't really actually look at any of the arguments. And when he cites actual technical literature, it doesn't help his argument at all, or it doesn't say at all what he says it says, or the only things that actually support him in quotes are the creationist works, which we also ripped to shreds. And so I finally just got finished with him, and now I've moved on to Snelling, and Snelling does what was the fossil record laid down rapidly, or something along those lines.
There's a few segments that I was going to be putting in the flood geology chapter that I'm holding in reserve because I suspect they're actually related to topics that you're going to be bringing up in that geology chapter. So I'll be folding all of that material over into that sideline, but we'll be juggling all the little details as we go, because once in a while we get simply structurally where I go, oh, actually that actually works better back here in this chapter, and that opens up space in that chapter. So it's a structural thing, ongoing work to deal with. And the one leitmotif that I can say is that every one of the Answers in Genesis books arguments are actually just Reader's Digest gloss. They're just summaries of their former talking points. There's virtually nothing that's really original in it. And some cases it's painfully dated as to how they're simply recycling the material that they've never bothered to fact check to begin with.
Definitely. Gary Parker is a good example of that. Gary Parker, no joke, had a single paragraph in his entire chapter that was new information. And I say new in a relative sense. Everything else was tropes we'd already covered. Yeah. Everything else. There was almost nothing new. It was one single paragraph.
It's a disease that seems to be catching, because what's surprising about Georgia Purdam's section is that for somebody who is as knowledgeable as she seems to ought to be on genetics, based on her training and what she's done as technical arguments, the little fluff, this meringue that she puts out in the answers book is like, oh, you could do better than that. I mean, you could do better than that. You'd still be wrong, but at least you could be more rigorous than that.
Oh yeah, definitely. She quote one of her arguments about how there are no like beneficial mutations that generate novel structures, whatever. Was a quote mine. It was just a couple of quote mines from this actually kind of interesting paper, but she really didn't bother to really read in it. She quoted I think 2 or 3 times, but it was just little snippet quote mines that seem like they said something, but if you actually read them in the context of the paragraph, it's actually if it's not the opposite, it doesn't mean what she wants you to think it means.
If any anti-evolutionist cites a normal technical paper that supposedly is helping their side, let your warning bells go off. Wait a minute, is that likely? And so if you can gain access to the original article, get it, read it. A, you'll learn stuff, and B, you'll learn that no, they've quote mined, and they are missing the main thrust of the argument. And that there will be usually lots of additional doors to even more information that even more don't help the anti-evolution case.
Yeah, it's the coral matter, for instance, because we had to order the book because Roth is the source of the argument, which is kind of funny that if sometimes when we look up an argument, we can link it to a technical work, but of course, which also comes along with all the creationist sources who link to it also. But in Roth's case, he was the originator of the argument, meaning that he fudged his data, obviously.
Yeah, and we literally can see him do it because there is no shape, way, or form. It wasn't an isolated thing. There were 2 primary source claims that he was making based on dated material where the sources did not make the assertion that he summarized.
Yeah, it was but in the process, because we had to wait like a week or so for the book to arrive, I was reading literature on coral growth and reef formations, and there it is. But I was reading lots of literature on coral growth and reef growth. No one was giving the sorts of rates that he claimed.
Yeah.
The closest I could find was like less than half of his rates. So
yeah. And so what clearly we had, I'll give him props at least. He has an index. That's better than replacing Darwin, which doesn't even have an index. That always pisses me off. But the thing is that Roth clearly has spiraled himself into an argument where he doesn't realize that the arguments he's making don't exist. I'd frankly compare him to some extent with Hugh Ross, who can augur himself into a position that actually didn't have a technical base to begin with. So I think it's counterpart to that. It's a bit different than what you get with a Jensen or a Sanford, who are detail fiddlers. And so they're trying to just inundate you with little minutia references. But there again, they live or die by the source analysis. And once you look at the original source material and go, oh, really? Is that what you thought to take out of that paper? I don't think so. There are a couple of places, where you just got to say, we can't even give you points for a good try here because this is just a terrible argument.
Yeah, it's because in our book we are going. It's like RJ said, we're going through it paragraph by paragraph, point by point, meaning we're also going through it source by source.
Yeah.
So when they cite something, we're going to tell you what the source is, and oftentimes we quote from the source. Of course, we're gonna look through it. We encourage you to look through it also to fact check us, and it never helps them ever.
Yeah, the Nelson Bugs thing on orphan gene was a real revelation. First of all, because it was not pegged as an intelligent design argument. It was just a kind of carping about the problems of orphan genes thing in this regular science publication. So they obviously parsed things very carefully so that there was no direct criticism of evolution in it. But they were casting doubt on the issue by constantly authority quoting material that was talking about problems or uncertainties. And the problem is the moment they were falling into the Dracula rule, the moment they cited those papers, everything in those papers is fair game. And it turns out there was a ton of information that they can't claim not to have been aware of because it was in the papers they cited for the authority quotes. And when they finally got down to their section where they were kind of addressing the actual examples of orphan genes and how the de novo genes can originate, they offered a whole string of papers of which they discussed nothing of the content, had only one gene mentioned, which they never mentioned again, and that was it. Oh, no. It's much worse than that. And I think most of this was really being spun by Nelson, because this has been his bugbear for quite some time, and he just keeps at it. He's been the thing that I tried to fact check on this audio interview that he had in 2017, but the web link doesn't work. So we can't find out what his current position is on there. Well, we'll have to go with fortunately for orphan fiction, we've got Nelson Buggs's paper. So I was a little bit snarky on that in how I phrased it. You'll find out when you read through the whole thing. But anyway, so we've got half an hour overtime on here. If I'm a little bit zonked, I've just come back from a zap trip over to the coast, and so I've been kind of juggling act on a bunch of different things to get things straightened out, but and still haven't unpacked everything from the trip. And we're planning on a big adventure in July as well. So I'll be off for Evolution Hour for a couple of weeks at the tail end of July. But that's the world will have to get along without me, I'm afraid, during that little period.
I'm not sure we can manage that, RJ.
I know. I have no illusions as to how relatively inconsequential all that is. But anyway, I will be getting back then to continuing the work on the thing. There's going to be a really juicy section on flood geology in my chapter, and also the geological issues from there. And we'll be talking about Mount St. Helens and supposedly catastrophic depositions and carvings of canyons and all of these other things. So it's a wide variety of subject matter. And then there's also the cosmological stuff and formation of stellar nucleotides and all that. The thing that's exasperating about the Answers in Genesis gang is that they trample everything. So in order to deal with them, we've got to cover so many disciplines and flesh out all of that material. But the upside is, boy, you'll learn a lot of stuff. And you realize that in the end, the thing they're trying to sell is just a cloud of expectations, and it's not, doesn't have substance. It never is going to have substance. They're never going to make the facts fit. And hopefully we can, I really want to aim to get rocks where they're out, certainly in time so people can give it as a Christmas gift.
Indeed, that is the hope. We're over, if not at halfway done, maybe a little bit over.
A little bit farther, and I've already gone through and done a pre-structuring of the subsections and the things structured. So then once we're all done, then I'll be plugging the actual text in, and then making minor tweaks and things as I go. And then at the very end, once everything is all structured, then I'll be putting page numbers to all the indexing. And thanks to your evil influence, young man, all of those damn taxa names that you insist on bringing up are in the index and that as well. So it's going to be a thoroughly indexed work. And but anybody that's seen Evolution Slam Dunk will be familiar with the typeface font. I'm going to be going on that same end, and the structure to kind of keep it manageable as a book size. But you'll get your money's worth out of it.
Yeah, it's going to be a large book.
Hi, Lisa. Yeah, it's bye here. We'll have to shut down and see you all next week. And it's a fun project to do. For writing puts you into a level of discipline. Writing a book at a level that you don't get if you're just doing a blog or something. That you have to have higher standards as to the comprehensivity that you're dealing with, the recognition of how it fits into a bigger literature, and also the rigor of keeping up with the up-to-date material on there. And between the two of us, we're really wanting to keep this thing current. So you'll find an awful lot of 2018 and 2019 technical papers popping up in this little puppy. So nobody, if they're going to find any errors in us, they're going to have to really hunt for it.
Yeah, that's the hope, at least.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll shut down for the night and see you all later on. And keep spreading the word on Tip. And if you haven't gotten Slam Dunk or Paralogs of Fog, get them. RJ can use the royalties, and you'll get 2 good books. Everybody that has read any of those works, make sure you put reviews up where you got it. If you got them on Amazon, don't tarry on that front. And keep haranguing if you think that some college or group or anywhere would benefit from my lecturing them, let them know I'm available. Heck, and probably way cheaper than Richard Dawkins. So anyway, stopping the broadcast, and we'll see you all next week.